Hello, everybody who's just joining us. We're about to get started here. We have Michael Schindhelm, director of The Chinese Lives of Uli Sigg. Uli Sigg should need no introduction if you watch the film. He's a businessman, former diplomat, and creator of the most comprehensive collection of contemporary Chinese art in the world, which is now housed at the M Plus Museum in Hong Kong. And Michael Schindhelm is the director of The Chinese Lives of Uli Sigg. He's a writer, filmmaker, curator, and cultural advisor based, like Dr. Sigg, in Switzerland. Thanks to both of you for taking the time to join us today. And I just wanted to know, sort of at the outset, how did this film come about? Was it kind of a collaborative idea, or Michael, did you sort of, propose it? I was just wondering how the collaboration happened.
There is another film I did already. I made in the early 2000s about the making of the Olympic construction of the Olympic Games Stadium in Beijing, Bird's Nest. I was at that time the director of the theater in Basel in Switzerland. The architects were still based in Basel too, so we became friends at that time in the late 90s. And when they were assigned to design this stadium, I was very keen to make a film about this. Because I myself East German, I lived for almost 30 years under communist rule in the Soviet Union and East Germany. I was always keen to see how China is trying to make the transformation after the Mao times. And that's why since the late 90s, I was keen to observe the developments in China. And so actually my filmmaking with China goes back in the meantime for almost 20 years. And Bird's Nest became the first major film about this. And at that time, as you may know, Ai Weiwei, the artist, became the advisor to Herzog Demeron to sort of make kind of connection between the star architects from Switzerland and the Chinese government. And I was rather interested in using the story of the stadium as a metaphor for the Chinese transformation to becoming a kind of world power, and the Olympics as a window to present to the world and to China itself what they want to be in the future. And so that's why the main characters of that film were already Herzog Demeron, Ai Weiwei, and also Uli Sigg, because this is how we got to know each other. And this film, the Chinese Lives of Uli Sigg, is like the second chapter. And I'm currently working on the third chapter, which will deal with the opening of the museum in Hong Kong, where again the same scenario and the same kind of cast will appear, because it will be again Herzog Demeron who have designed, and plus it will be again Ai Weiwei, sort of, and it will be certainly again Uli Sigg appearing also in that third chapter. This is a kind of trilogy over 20 years where I'm trying to use or to explore how contemporary art, design and architecture reflect the social and political transformation in China today.
Interesting. And I rewatched the film this week, and it was kind of a great escape from being trapped in quarantine. And I really enjoyed it the second time through. And questions came to mind that maybe are sort of outside the bounds of the film that just occurred to me. And one of them is, Uli, were you interested in art before you went to China to establish this joint venture, or was it something that as you were living there you sort of discovered this, or was it an interest before you ventured there?
There was an interest before. I have been very involved in contemporary art, forefront of contemporary art through friends, and I got very passionate about it. So when I came to China, I had already been in this world, but totally ignorant about China and Chinese contemporary art. And I hope to find an access to China, another access than what I was allowed to see. So yes, I had knowledge, actually in-depth knowledge about the forefront of contemporary art, but no knowledge about China whatsoever.
And how did you sort of start to meet these artists and collect their work? Was it through your official business you were doing there? Or was this kind of something you were just doing on your own after hours? How did you sort of establish those relationships?
Of course, it was a very, very counterproductive to business at that time. As a foreigner, one of the few foreigners who were carefully observed, you were never alone, you couldn't have a conversation on four eyes was simply impossible. So I had to be very cautious throughout the 80s so as not to endanger my job and the enterprise, and in particular not to endanger the artists. So that was a very slow start. I had to look at material and, meet middlemen, so to speak, middle women rather than artists. But that changed very much in the 90s. And then I just moved freely. I took the night. I sat in my car and just drove away alone and met many artists wherever I went, but not as a daily routine, so visible.
I see. And in terms of your collecting, I mean, at the time, and I guess today, because I think maybe your philosophies, from what I've read, have maybe changed. But how much of your personal taste sort of went into the collection, and how much of it was in terms of thinking about documenting this particular period in Chinese art?
Well, after a very short time where I started to collect just to my own liking, my own taste, as you say, I realized no one was collecting, even in a remotely systematic way. So that's when I changed my focus from my personal taste to collect as I imagined an institution, national institution, should but didn't. So then, of course, personal taste, always appears somewhere. Subjectivity always appears somewhere. But, I was very careful not to make it the main criteria, but the main criteria being what, I envisioned to be part of this storyline of Chinese contemporary art, entering the world and kind of mirroring the art production. So it certainly was not about my taste, but, as I said, we can't say, there is not subjectivity there somewhere. But you have to be aware of your own blind spot, I think, in this respect.
So from kind of early on, you were thinking in terms maybe of that this should maybe go to an institution in some form, I guess, right?
Yes. I didn't know where to and when and how, but I just did it with the idea of bringing it to China so that the Chinese people who do not really know their contemporary art, would have a place to go and see.
Yeah. Well, we have a question from someone in the audience, and it was actually one that I was kind of interested in as well. Given the recent political developments in Hong Kong, are you concerned about potential censoring of art and exhibitions at M+?
Of course, this question is in the air, but there's no one who can answer it, with certainty. What I can say at this stage is that the authorities involved in the M+ Museum, which will be hosting the collection, starting from the chairman of West Kowloon Cultural District, of which M+ is one part, to CEO of Cultural District, to the director of M+, they all have reconfirmed, their very firm commitment to adhere to the contract and, to guarantee, say, freedom of art in the realm of this museum. That's within their jurisdiction. So yes, they reconfirmed.
Great. And Michael, do you imagine this, well, of course, we don't know how things are going to develop now, but do you imagine this will be incorporated into your ongoing trilogy of films? I mean, do you see this affecting, what the work you're doing now?
I mean, as I said, I'm coming from I have a communist background, and that's why freedom of expression is one of the things which are particular my concern. And I worked in Hong Kong for other reasons as a consultant for the West Kowloon Cultural District already since 2009, and helped developing kind of, you could say, software master plan for the entire plot. The West Kowloon is the entire plot of the Victoria Harbour development where the M+ is part of. And so at that time we were conceiving concepts, and M+ was one of these. And I always thought Hong Kong is a very particular place because it reminded me to some extent on Berlin in the old Cold War times. where there was an outpost of the Western world within the communist countries, in this case East Germany, sort of showcasing and transmitting certain Western values of art and culture. And for me, for example, as someone who grew up on the other side of the wall and the Iron Curtain, this was extraordinarily important for me. So the presence of West Berlin, the presence of what was disseminated through West Berlin in terms of music, in terms of, by the way, also by Americans who, as you may know, there was a radio broadcaster in Berlin, which was very important. So many things I learned about the rest of the world through these media and also through art and music, etc., and film. And to some extent, you can say that Hong Kong played that role for a long time, also for China. And you see it also in that film, how people explain, for example, the young artist Zhao Fei, how she, as a young girl who grew up in the Pearl River Delta, was influenced by the pop cultural programs, which were at that time already disseminated to China and reached first this area through Hong Kong. And I think that's why, of course, the M Plus as a museum and the decision of making Uli's collection the major part of their collection is a very clear statement on kind of independent position towards mainland China and, of course, the political situation there. And it will be, for me, very interesting, of course, to now, on the one hand, see where they stand with the museum and the development and the programming of the collection, etc. But at the same time, also to embed it within this political and social environment with the umbrella movement in the first place. And as you probably know, quite a few major figures of the umbrella movement are artists or are related to the art scene in Hong Kong. That's why certainly that will make part of the film.
Of course, yeah. And Uli, did you ever consider giving your collection to a Chinese mainland institution, or I mean, I assume there would have been some difficulties with that, but was Hong Kong just sort of the only place you felt, that it would be properly displayed?
Actually, Beijing or Shanghai were my first impulses, the destination for the collection. And yes, I did have negotiations in that respect, intense negotiations, including Ministry of Culture. But, it just proved to be very difficult for a number of reasons. Of course, one reason being censorship. I told, the various authorities, yes, I have to accept there is censorship, but I would like to know the rules so as to be able to assess what's going, to be on display and what may disappear in the cellar. But it proved not to be possible to have a very clear answer. And at the same time, Hong Kong approached me very aggressively. And, as Michael just said, he was involved in this particular strategic plan in Hong Kong with the West Kowloon Cultural District. They showed me this very impressive museum on the drawing board, but there was no content at the time. So for them, it was very, very important to, secure something like this collection. So in the end, we came to terms rather rapidly, and in particular because there were no such constraints, that I have just described for mainland. And Hong Kong is also China already then. Now we are made understood every day that it's also China. But say my original idea of having it in China, also in Hong Kong, was fulfilled. But Hong Kong also could guarantee that there will be a world-class institution, really ambitious. So, what more could you expect at the time?
Exactly, yeah. And I have to say, my experience dealing with filmmakers on the mainland, they have a similar feeling about, you never quite know what the rules are, I suppose, in terms of, what's forbidden and what isn't. And is the collection M Plus available like for touring exhibitions, or is it just permanently housed there?
It's now their property, even though physically it's still in Switzerland because the building not yet ready. That will happen sometime this summer. So we will start shipping, but that's a process of like 2 years to do that.
Wow. But may I just add here, Uli, you actually donated 2/3 more or less of your collection of that time, 2012. The donation was agreed on. So there's a major part, a substantial part of your collection still owned by yourself, and that will be also like this, and will actually keep in your as your property. You will keep it as your property, and therefore will be able also to show it. There will be more exhibitions of your exhibitions elsewhere, independently from M+ and what they are going to do. I think that's important.
Yes, you are right. So I do exhibitions with that number of works because basically the cutoff was like 2011. I made the donation 2012. So the works I collected thereafter, they're all in my hand, plus some of the previous works. So yes, I do a number of exhibitions now. Right now I have one in Italy, which has been closed due to the lockdown. It should have opened last week, I understand. So of course I can go on doing my own projects, but M+ will designate, a substantial part of its big exhibition space to permanently show the collection.
Right, and in the film, it seems to be a kind of tantalizing question as to the works that you decided to keep and not donate. So, are you willing to say why you decided to keep a certain amount and donate, a larger amount? Were there reasons behind that?
Well, my ambition was to make a choice from my works so that an audience can read the storyline of Chinese contemporary art from its, inception or its predecessors in the 70s to the point of time of the donation, 2012. So, of course, there are works that are redundant in the collection, maybe similar somewhat, or gifts from the artists, which I, were made to me personally, which I kept. So, but I actually, did not want to keep the best in my own hands. That wasn't it, because I owe this to the artists, right? I owe it to the artists that, they show their best. So basically, yes, it was just what it takes to best illustrate the storyline of contemporary art. That's how I chose.
I see. Someone asked, what surprised you the most about the artists in China when you started collecting their work?
Well, first, I was surprised, again, due to my ignorance about China at the time, but, I shared that with almost everyone in the West, that they have been so isolated from the art development outside China. And what, I hoped for to see their contemporary art turned out to be not really contemporary, but rather derivative of Western art they had just gained some restricted access to. So, I hoped I would see this fantastic contemporary art, but not for years. That was my biggest surprise at the time.
But then, of course, this very exciting movement developed, I guess, sort of as you were there. You were sort of there, watching this emergence of this generation of artists kind of coming out of the post-Mao world. Where were they sort of like getting their ideas? Where were they seeing art? I mean, what got them kind of like motivated to make these, at times quite political paintings, and definitely, addressing the past in a new way? Who were they? What artists were they inspired by? What were they seeing? If it wasn't happening in China, what did they have access to, I guess?
Well, the basic step forward after the death of Mao and after 2 years of like interregnum of Huaguofang was that all of a sudden there was this newly gained freedom, although a very short window of time. So it began with them being allowed to do what I consider autonomous art. First time they could decide what to represent in their art. That was a major step. but their knowledge of what existed outside, say, the socialist realism, outside Chinese tradition, was more random. You know, someone maybe brought a book about some Western contemporary artist or a catalog, you know, or they had seen mainly, of course, black and white, bad reproductions of something. So very fragmented and random knowledge were determining the first years. And I think Michael really pointed that out very well in the film, like using these different generations of artists. And so what are now already very mature and older artists at that time could explain why they have this very limited knowledge.
Oh. There's maybe something interesting to mention in my conversations with the artists. I learned this early. In particular, if you speak about my generation, the generation of Ai Weiwei, born around 1960, and maybe even more so the older ones, the even older artists, the only access to art was often through books, which were dating back to the times when the Soviet Union was providing them in the 50s with prints of art, which were actually collected by Russians, Soviet Russian scholars, and they were the same books I was used to, maybe too. Very bad prints, post-war times, Stalin times, maybe. And so this is how they were introduced, these generations, these two generations of people, how they were introduced to Western art. And one of the reasons why these people became probably artists on the one hand was also that they were able to travel, and for the first time to see in their own eyes. They traveled to Italy, to France, to visit museums, but also churches. And I know from some of the artists that they were really in shock when they saw the difference between what they had seen in the Russian type of Soviet type of books, book prints, and the reality, what they saw later. And some of them were really almost discouraged to continue as artists, but others were even more inspired. I think it's a major thing that China opened the borders at some point to these people. For example, Ai Weiwei left, I think, in 1982 for America, for the United States, where he lived for the next more than 10 years, 15 years or so. Many artists of that generation traveled to the West very curiously to study the Western art at that time, and that had an enormous impact and changed probably many things. And this is also probably a reason why at least a major part of these artists started also using the language of Western art. Not all of them, though, but some of them, because they were very much influenced and inspired by this. So when they were able to get really in touch with the rest of the world. I think that is an interesting narrative also for how important it is for people to travel in the end, and to now in the coronavirus period in particular, right? How important it is to see things with your own eyes, to be able to go to a museum, to be able to go to a church, and to experience art with your own eyes.
Well put. I agree. Uli, I came across a quote of yours. I was reading your essay on the M+ site about your collection, and I'd like you to elaborate on something I found very interesting. You said people see you as a collector, but you see yourself more as a researcher. And I'm kind of interested if you could elaborate a little bit more about how you seeing yourself that way.
Yeah, well, many collectors seem to be born as collectors. They have this urge. Wherever it may come from, we don't know exactly, instinct, or, part of the brain, whatever. Probably I wasn't. So I was always very interested just in art as experience, and but for very long it wasn't about owning art. So maybe I'm not the classical collector, but I was very interested in contemporary art and seeing, having this opportunity, which is very rare, to enter a cultural space day one when this movement is being born, contemporary art. Of course, I researched it more like in an academic way almost, I would say, but also in a practical way. I had the opportunity to see all these artists. I have probably seen 2,000 artists, I don't know, in China over 40 years of time. And at some point, I became very known when I came to a city somewhere. Then I would have an artist to visit, and that artist would have to take me to all his friends, her friends. And so that's how I could see a lot of art, more than maybe anyone else at the time. I created this artist award, which then again allowed me to collect a lot of material at the time when there were no books available yet about contemporary art, no internet, of course. We speak like mid-90s. So that made me kind of, a researcher. I was just fortunate enough to have the financial means to buy part of the results of my research. And, we speak about a few $100, $1,000, later about maybe a few $1,000s for an important piece. So that's why I, still see myself that way. But to some people, it may appear odd that I see myself as a collector.
Right.
I would like to add something here, because I found this particularly intriguing, this approach, because when Uli arrived in China, quite obviously there was no whatsoever information about art, contemporary art. There were no galleries, there were no museums, there were no media, no curators. Even the artists themselves wouldn't know necessarily each other. So and that's of course an interesting experience for someone in the West to imagine that there is no access. You go to a country with several hundred million of people and the big cities, but you don't really know if there are any artists and what they do. And how would you find out? And I think that Uli's approach of founding this award was extraordinarily smart, because the moment this award was in place, so there was someone suddenly saying, I'm interested in art, and whoever wants to apply, please send me your artwork, and we are going to assess it. And of course, there were probably also people hesitating, but obviously hundreds of artists suddenly popped up and applied. So in other words, this was the key of getting to know what's actually going on, where people sit, what they do, how they work, what kind of art they're doing, etc. So that gave Uli an exclusive access, immediate access to a landscape of artists, which was so far totally invisible. And I think that was a great thing. And we did a research about this at the university. Although I'm not a scholar, but I did actually quite serious research on that award, which is still online. If you want to watch this one, this is a massive open online course we did a few years ago about exclusively this approach. And there's one more thing to say. As you said, Uli, earlier already, you were not necessarily always just choosing according to your personal choice or taste, but rather because you had already formed a kind of collective of people whom you trusted to have a say in this. And this was also through the award, because the Chinese Contemporary Art Award, what it was called at that time, was helped by international scholars or international curators from both the Western world and China. They were forming a jury, and they would actually, together with Uli, decide on who are the best artists of the year. And some of these Western curators didn't know much about Chinese art. So this was a way, on the one hand, also to introduce to the Western art scene Chinese contemporary art. And on the other hand, it allowed the first encounter and exchange between Western and Chinese curators, experts. So that was indeed a very important thing in many ways, because, for example, the first, if I'm not mistaken, the first chairman of that jury was Harald Seemann, was at the time a very influential curator, and was running in 1999 the Venice Biennale, the Art Biennale, where he opened up also the Arsenale. And among other things, he invited more than 20 Chinese artists, which were not sent by the Chinese government, but by an independent curator, to show their artwork. And of course, Uli had helped Harald Seemann through this award to identify these people. And that was the first time that a kind of independent exhibition of Chinese contemporary art happened, thanks to this award.
This kind of plays into another question that came to mind in another interview. Uli, you mentioned that when you were beginning to collect, people in China weren't necessarily interested in contemporary Chinese art; that it was mostly Western collectors. So, was the Biennale in 1999 kind of the moment that interest sort of shifted? Because I assume it's no longer the case. People in China are, I'm sure, collecting all the time now. But when did that sort of shift start to happen in China itself?
Well, that was not so much the result of 99 yet. That happened after 2000, in 2, 3. Actually, 99 was very important because before, Chinese contemporary art had only been collected by people who were in China, like expatriates, professional people, diplomats, not traditional art collectors. And the big international art collectors were still neglecting Chinese contemporary art production. So the art pieces in the 90s were mainly bought by, these professional people coming to China. And they may have been then somewhere, I don't know, in Minnesota, in a dining room of an engineer, maybe only that one piece, important for Chinese art. No one would know about its whereabouts. So that was the first phase. And then 99, these important international collectors first time had to look at Chinese contemporary art. Before, they basically, there were exhibitions in the West, that's by far not the first, but they were in small venues and they were visited by China freaks and sinologists and, just very few people. So in 99, the whole art world being assembled in Venice, they all had to walk through this Arsenale, which had been opened by the first time by Harald Zimmer, and they just had to see all this Chinese contemporary art. And that brought a number of them first time to purchase Chinese contemporary art. And only then, after 3-4 years, the Chinese collectors started to appear on the scene and then started to buy substantially. And then many Chinese investors got into the game because they could see how prices rose quite rapidly in early 2000, and they felt here is a game to play. So, and that of course induced more growth. And these works you bought for $5,000, 96, 97. 10 years later, you would have to pay in the auction $5 million, $6 million, maximum price even $25 million. So, that kind of speculation brought more speculation. But then came the crash, which hit the Chinese art market just as much as any other.
Maybe one more thing, which makes Uli's approach to collecting particular, is that he from the beginning decided not to sell. There was something which was often misunderstood, that people thought he's now speculating with exactly this kind of escalation of prices, etc. He never did, and artists could really rely on this. There were a few other also major collectors who started maybe not as soon as you, Uli, but similar time. At some point, many of these people have sold and made a fortune with this for sometimes also, again, humanitarian or kind of philanthropic reasons. But Uli actually always stuck to the plan. This is a collection which has to grow in order to, sooner or later, will be presented in a public museum, ideally in China, to Chinese people. And this is the legacy, I would say. And in some ways, it's great that worked out.
I was wondering, since it's been a few years since the film was made, I think it was 2016, do either of you have thoughts on how the Chinese art scene has changed since then? Have you seen any kind of different trends emerging?
Well, is it Michael? Shall I?
No, of course, it's your question.
Yeah. Of course, the Chinese art collectors, who became a very important force in driving the Chinese art market. Now we talk distribution, not so much art creation. They all of a sudden discovered the international art market. because they started to travel. They went to the big fairs and all of this. So all of a sudden, many of them turned to what we would call global art, or say global mainstream art, and started to spend money actually more on international art scene and less on Chinese domestic art creation. So that was a major change happening over the last few years, which at the time of the film was not yet this phenomenon it became today. That's one thing. And I guess the other, if we look at art creation, that the major turn to their own tradition became a strong trend in Chinese art creation. In the 80s, even 90s, with some famous exception, I know you have in your museum, the artists, really didn't care about their own tradition. In fact, they wanted to get away from it, and they were fascinated by Western conceptual art, rather. And that was, the thing. But like then later, after year 2010, 15, something like that, more and more artists got kind of disillusioned of this type of Western conceptual art, which also doesn't provide all the answers, they were hoping for. And so you could see this major trend of many, many artists to their own roots. It doesn't mean, to reproduce that, but as a main resource for art creation. So that's a major trend in art creation, while, of course, the other part of the Chinese art community is still very strongly wants to be part of the global mainstream and, succeed in that part of the art world. So these are, fairly new or fairly recent.
I again would like to add something which was already sort of emerging and latent, and now is in full blow. I think is the new generation. There's, of course, now a way larger complexity in the Chinese contemporary art. That's what Uli is anyway saying. But I think there's, you already started around that time, and we also, in the end of the film, there are a number of short clips with a couple of artists of another generation. And in the meantime, those people are 35, 40 already, so they are even not the very young people anymore, but still they have a different language. They have also maybe a different relationship to their own country. They may have also a different relationship with the rest of the world, being abroad, etc. So all of this matters to some extent. And of course, I think the political situation in China has changed over the last 5 years, and that's something I would probably also like to reflect on in the next chapter of my research in terms of filmmaking in China, because I think although you felt already different, I say I'm exploring it now since 2003. Certainly in 2014-15, something had already started to change, but now, of course, China has become kind of almost different country socially, I think.
I was going to kind of bring that up, but how much does the changes in power, and how much does this affect artists in terms of how they can express themselves in terms of censorship? I mean, you mentioned it, taking it into consideration in displaying your collection on the mainland, but how much does this affect these days artists themselves? Do the rules sort of shift depending who's kind of come to power, or do things kind of remain steady for them?
Of course, just as Michael described, this is a major impact now on art creation in China. President Xi made it clear in his speech to the cultural elite, which was kind of emulated, similarly to Mao's speech in the 40s, where he gave his view, and his view how art, he was, of course, talking broadly about also writing, architecture, also visual art, is probably the traditional paradigm of Chinese art creation, which is art about beauty, harmony, also, educating the masses, and the artist supposed to rejoice with the masses, suffer with the masses. while, of course, the paradigm of contemporary art as we know it in the Western world is one of not as much how the world ought to be, but representing the world how it is. And, social critique, documenting things rather than idealizing them. So it's a very different paradigm. And this paradigm is not very welcome. But of course, the outside world, is desiring contemporary art as we know it outside China, rather. But Chinese government is concerned about the projection of China through that kind of art outside China. Of course, also inside China, that's beyond control. Outside China, less. So, we move in that kind of how to say, these numbers of influences predict and influence very much what the Chinese artist in China can generate or not.
Mm-hmm. I see.
And can present in China or not. And what can be exported or not.
I see.
I think there's also, if I may add this, something interesting which reminds me to some extent also on America or in the old days in the Soviet Union. China has in the meantime become such a big country that for many people, China is almost identical with the world. There is almost nothing outside of, and I may say, that's my experience. I made also several times in the States that for many people, America is almost identical with the world. And I studied in the Soviet Union 40 years ago. At that time, Soviet Union was similar. Of course, there are elites, there are people who are well-traveled and informed, etc., artists in particular. But the society is actually very much circling around their national issues. Everything is very national, and the rest of the world doesn't affect their life and their mind anymore the same way. And I think that was very different at the time when Uli, when you came to the country. And even later, there was a curiosity. There was also maybe to some extent kind of inferiority complex. People really wanted to know what's going on there. They felt that we need all of this. We need to absorb the Western values and, of course, also the Western products, etc. We need to embrace this. I think that has also changed to a certain extent because most of these things are produced in the meantime in China itself. So they don't necessarily need the West and the world anymore the same way they did 20 years ago or even 10 years ago.
Yeah, interesting. Well, sorry.
Of course, there's a lot art can be done with, art does not have to be political. That's a one school. So there is still a lot of space for Chinese artists to move in and to do art. So, there are formalist issues, etc. There's tradition. So there is still space, for artists, but yes, there are severe constraints.
I see. Well, I think it's about time to wrap things up unless anyone wants to throw a final question into the chat, but I don't see anything popping up. But thanks to both of you. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.